So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for joining the third session for the Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Lunch Talk Series. We're super excited to have Dana Guernsey, who is the Vice President of Product and Energy Markets at Voltus. I am Geoff Parker, the Director of the Master of Engineering Management program at Dartmouth and also a Professor of Engineering. And Dana and I collaborate in that role. Dana's been incredibly generous with her time to serve as one of our Corporate Collaboration Council members, and is a three-time alumna of Dartmouth College, both undergrad AB and then a BE, and then a graduate of our Master of Engineering Management program. Dana comes to us in her current role, as I said, of Vice President of Product and Energy Markets. That's at Voltus. She has a long career in this, where she also spent time at Enernoc as Director of Energy Markets, and honestly came to this quite naturally as one of the first members of the Formula Hybrid student team, which is integrated now with Dartmouth Formula Racing. So super excited to have Dana here. The talk or the basic kind of background is critical infrastructure in a climate changing world. And I think some of that infrastructure has to be the market mechanisms and sort of the technological systems that we put in place to integrate and organize all of the sort of much wider variety of energy resources that we can use to help address really critical issues of climate change and adaptation. So with that as an introduction, Dana, if I could hand it over to you, I believe you have a few slides. And then for all the people in attendance, there's a little Q&A. If you could please use the question and answer, and then we'll, for the most part, do those. I think Dana's plan is to speak for about 20 or 30 minutes. Then we'll open it up and I'll kind of moderate questions. But if there are some clarifying things, I might interrupt you just for a couple of short things. So with that, Dana, over to you.
Sure, and please do interrupt me. In particular, keep me honest if I go too far down a path of using acronyms that folks might not know or industry jargon. I'll do my best to not do that, but Geoff, you're here to keep me honest. So thank you everyone for having me. Thanks, Geoff, for inviting me. As Geoff said, I've spent my entire career thinking about actually the demand side of the energy equation and what now we'll talk about as distributed energy resources. So I'll dive in and, before we even get into the nuts and bolts of DERs and what they are, I wanted to take one big step back to just get some perspective on why we're seeing an unprecedented pace of change in electricity markets. And, so this picture here, the internet, right? The internet was commercialized in a practical way in 1983 as a network of networks, after which the first web browser that most people use as the interface to the internet was released in 1990. So it's barely 30 years ago, and yet when you travel to Dallas, Geoff, from San Francisco or Tokyo and all points in between, your phone's internet service doesn't stop working due to the simple fact that the internet operates on a single network topology. So TCP/IP, the single protocol that your phone will work on. And as a result, these standards are the foundation upon which some of the greatest innovations have been developed. Instant communication across the world on any device or platform, social media, the accessibility of virtually any piece of information in your hand. It offers a glimpse into the value of innovation networks and distributing computing and information to the edge in a democratized way. I can plug in my computer and be part of an effort across the world. So why am I talking about the internet? Why does that even matter? I think despite the fact that the grid was the original internet, if you will, the original network, we're stuck with an electricity grid that is highly centralized, balkanized. It lacks fundamental standards, drives me crazy on a daily basis. It's built on a virtual Tower of Babel. What one grid operator might call synchronized reserves, another might call spinning reserves. What the independent system operator of New England will call their forward capacity market, the New York independent system operator will call installed capacity. So we just haven't gotten to a common lingua franca, let alone technology standards. And that is what is about to change in a big, big way. And so a theme that I'll, kind of keep trying to bring in today is that it's as much technology innovation as it is policy innovation. Rather than take my word for it, though, I like to quote people that are far more experienced in the arena. The godfather of demand response, John Wellinghoff, former FERC chairman, authored the first distributed energy resources standards in wholesale electricity markets, creating a skeleton key that began to transform these things back in 2008. Without getting too wonky, Jeff, there was an order called 719 FERC Order, numbers their orders, which led to FERC Order 7. Sorry about that. And these orders were very directly the result of early electricity market restructuring on the heels of the California energy crisis and Enron's manipulation of markets. Regulators saw then the early signs that by engaging the demand side of the market, the distributed energy ecosystem, if you will, there existed a powerful and fundamental tool to ensure competitive, reliable, and democratic markets. So those of you who maybe participate with your business or your home in a demand response program have 719 to thank. Those of you who will in the future participate in wholesale markets with your electric vehicle or your rooftop solar unit or your home battery storage have 719 to thank, excuse me. And FERC Order 745 leveled the playing fields, which is really all we ask for. We want the demand side of the equation to be able to participate in these markets the same way that the supply side does. And so rather than conjecture on things, I also now want to show you the money angle of how this all comes into play. So first, a bit of terminology. Energy in this regard is the electric energy that is actually produced and consumed. So you use a kilowatt, you pay for a kilowatt hour. Capacity is the ability to produce energy. So the capability to produce energy. In financial terms, it would be the call option on energy. Grid operators are in business to create a reliable grid. Blackouts to consumers are entirely unacceptable. And so we build out our grids to meet a forecasted peak electricity demand that we will ever have. Grid operators will look out years. They'll say, what will the forecast be 3 years from now to procure in that forward market? And then they apply a healthy margin on top of that, say 20% reserve. How that then trickles down to consumers on your actual bills is in these demand charges. So entirely unrelated to the energy consumed, how much do you as an individual business or resident contribute to the grid's peak demand needs is your demand charge. So to get back to these trends here, the net result of this chart is that your bill now is roughly a third demand charges and 2/3 energy, whereas in 2000, it was less than 10% demand charges. So a couple of things are happening here. First, consumers are demanding that their bills be unbundled, so to speak. Utilities more and more are required to allocate costs accurately as opposed to simply bundling everything into a weighted dollar per megawatt hour rate. Second, we're consuming fewer megawatt hours per unit of GDP. We are more efficient. You all have installed LEDs and reduced waste. Modern technology and real-time energy data help. Businesses can manage now what they can measure. And so this combination of unbundling and efficiency has resulted in more costs being allocated to infrastructure or demand charges. And finally, the energy costs in deregulated markets, at least, are subject to market forces. So the same isn't always true for megawatts or demand costs. Even in deregulated territories, capacity costs are market-based, and utilities have regulated rate-based transmission costs. They've skyrocketed. Utilities can build out transmission. Their PUC, the Public Utility Commission, will approve it, and then they rate base it. And so consumers bear the cost of that. 1 megawatt of transmission capacity would cost a consumer about $10,000 in the year 2000. This year in Ohio, it's $80,000 for that same megawatt. In northern New Jersey, it's an obnoxious $160,000 per megawatt just for the capacity for the transmission lines and wires of the grid. So anytime in a capital market where there is a clear price signal, you start to see market innovation. Before I even go there, though, just one more view of the grid from a high level. And many of you have probably seen charts like this, but this is 1 year of energy data for PJM, the largest grid in the country, in the world, I think. And so although megawatt hours are flat to declining because fuel is cheap and we're getting more efficient, the infrastructure to deliver electricity is expensive, especially on peak when 10 to 15% of the grid's infrastructure is used for less than 1% of the hours. It's extremely expensive. This problem has existed for a long time. It's only getting worse. Our summer peaks are getting peakier. Our winter peaks are getting peakier with polar vortexes and heat waves. But the good news is that there is an abundance of inexpensive, easy to deploy, immediately available, highly reliable, distributed resources that can clip this peak and offer a ton of benefits to both those that are the resource owners as well as all ratepayers. There's savings across the board.
Can I just keep you on that slide a minute, Dana? I think this is a really important point. And just sort of ram it home. I mean, you were talking about the dollar per megawatt. And if you can clip, say, 10% of this, then you're literally looking at what, 14,000 megawatt reduction? And then if you think about the capacity that's installed to deliver those, at whatever price, it's a big number. And that's just on the infrastructure side, right?
That's right.
Yeah, so just to, I mean, that's talking about a major capital cost savings, you know, that we're incurring right now to deal with the spikiness that you're showing us.
Yeah, and so just as another sidebar, Geoff, the analogy I'll sometimes share is, imagine if our highway infrastructure system was built out in this same way. You would have, I mean, all of our highways would look like some highways I've seen pictures of in Texas, where it's like 18-lane highways just to meet peak demand, when really most of the time you just need 2 or 3 lanes. That would be we would think that that is an insanely inefficient use of capital resources. And yet that is what this electric grid is built on, because there's no concept, not yet anyway, and not meaningfully yet anyway, of energy storage. So you can't just have traffic. The grid would go completely on the fritz, and we would have rolling blackouts if demand exceeded supply. And so it's this delicate balance, minute to minute, hour to hour, year to year, of making supply and demand meet.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And that's how the system was always conceived of, is that sort of second by second matching of supply and demand. Anyway, just thought I'd give you a chance to sort of emphasize.
Yeah, well, it's a funny segue into this next slide here, because, you know, what I'm saying is that the opportunity with the electric grid is actually made worse. This problem we're talking about of infrastructure, it's made worse with renewables. And look no further than the California duck curve, right? So a ton of innovation has come from the generation side of this industry. Solar and wind, virtually non-existent 20 years ago, today make up 9% of all US installed capacity. But they have their own set of operational challenges, which many are quick to point fingers at. But really, that's where other resource types and distributed energy resources can come in. So behind the meter, customer sided assets, whether it's battery storage, behind the meter generation, or good old fashioned load curtailment, are the backstop to situations when the sun goes down, the wind stops blowing unexpectedly, right? In California, so what you're looking at here are some screenshots from what happened this past summer in California. There were actually rolling blackouts for the first time since the whole Enron debacle. And it was a really wild thing to watch. I could talk about what happened in California this past summer for a long time, but the middle graph here, what you're seeing is the clip of that peak between the day ahead forecast and what actually happened in yellow. It almost looks like someone just bit a bite out of the top of that peak demand, and that was load response and load flexibility, demand response programs, consumer outreach. The governor declared an emergency. It was all hands on deck in California, and the industry responded and proved once again that load can be flexible. So let's look at the demand side.
But actually, just stay on that with me for a moment, because you said something I think that is really important, which is the use of these renewable resources, which is wonderful in tamping down the number of megawatt hours that have to be supplied by conventional resources. But at the very same time, it reduces the utilization of the transmission side. And so it actually is making things spikier. And so that's, I think, kind of at the heart of some of the economics of why doing a better job of organizing DERs is so useful.
Completely agree. It's a great point. And then so on the supply side, we have the renewables. And then on the demand side, the benefits of electrifying our grid are well known. With the growth of EVs, which some forecast that by the year 2050, the capacity of electric vehicles will amount to 3 times the capacity of all electric generation. That's a crazy statistic. And these types of projections, when it comes to solar and EV growth, tends to fall short. They tend to adjust their predictions. Oh, it'll happen in 2045, 2040. So this is coming. We're electrifying more and more. There are Bitcoin miners and cannabis farms using more and more electricity. And so we need to wean the fossil fuels in favor of electricity. For any of you that have heard of the Rewiring America effort, that's exactly where they're getting at, is even for the common American, for the middle class or lower income Americans, we want to make, their mission is to make electrifying the home an economic opportunity for everybody. So we're seeing all this unprecedented reliability, economic, sustainability challenges. And so that brings us back to the point, which is that these distributed energy resources will accelerate positive changes and increase reliability, decrease costs, and allow us to transition to the clean energy economy that we want to. So Geoff, you and I were talking, and we were reflecting that if you think about it, we all originally, I take no credit for any of this, but the broader we originally built the electric grid to adjust supply to meet demand. It was unfathomable that anything other than the power plant would be adjusted up and down based on the ebbs and flows of what the homes and factories and office buildings needed, right? And so the entire system, including the market rules, are all organized with this system in mind. Anytime I read a market rule that makes no sense to me, I have to remind myself to think about it as if this is the world. And then the answer becomes clear. And so what we're now in the process of doing, and we need to do more and more and more, is evolving to also adjust the demand side to meet supply. Because now we have these supply side resources, in particular with the intermittent renewables, that with some exceptions where you would actually curtail wind, for example, we don't control Mother Nature, right? So what we need to do is we need to make sure that we can harness that and adjust our side of the equation on the demand side.
So Dana, let's just stay on this for a minute because a
Yeah.
question did come in, because I think we often tend to think of adjusting demand down to meet supply, but of course the opposite problem can easily happen, as we see in the duck curve and others, where there's just too much supply from the renewable side. The question is, as a curtailment alternative, would you think green hydrogen would be a potential solution? But maybe just put that into a broader context of how do we use more energy when it's abundant and free, and what are some of the ideas there? And if you're going to get to that, then just hit it in the back of the deck. But
no, I'll just hit it right now. So how do we use more? I mean, so one is in the form of energy storage. Rather than dumping the winds, let's store it. And so the energy storage industry, their costs are falling. If you look at their costs, it's following kind of the same logarithmic curve as solar. So let's store that energy. And then also let's look at our behavior. A lot of industries that we work with can shift demand around. So if they know that there's a time when, the signal from the market could be something even like negative pricing, right? Negative pricing means we want demand to increase. So if you're a business owner and you are exposed to that, like rational economics would be, great, let's run my business more. Let's throw an extra shift on while the pricing is negative. Not only will I have free energy, but I will be earning money by ramping up my production. Cold storage facilities can be very flexible. So there's all kinds of things that within industries they can do. Homeowners can, choose to run their washing machine or not. And we need the tools in the IT layer to help us make this all extremely simple, right? Like that's, part of what we're doing in Voltus is making this simple for the clients. They're not in the business of managing their energy. They're in the business of managing their business. And so we want it to be no brainer, push button, simple. Imagine an alert. Oh, would you like to make $5 now? Sure. By running your washing machine? Great. Like that kind of stuff is the trend. I'm not a hydrogen expert, but I frankly welcome all options that move us away from like very fixed fossil fuel needs to more of this like orchestra or sweet symphony of resources out there. So this slide probably means nothing to most people, but there was a recent FERC order. It was Order 2x4, 2222, 2222, whatever you want to call it. I first heard it called Order 2x4 by the folks at the Southwest Power Pool who refused to call it 2222. But I mentioned that policy is just as important as technology. And in September of 2020, an amazing landmark order was passed that probably missed the news cycle because, well, 2020 had quite the news cycle. Yeah. But so here you have Neil Chatterjee. Chairman Chatterjee was a Trump-appointed FERC chairman. He was originally known as Senator McConnell's coal guy, okay? I never thought that I would appreciate Senator McConnell's coal guy, not to get into politics, as much as I think Neil Chatterjee just did something amazing for this industry. Ironically, after doing this and after holding a couple of meetings on carbon pricing, Trump promptly demoted him in November. So that was short-lived, but ultimately, FERC Order 2222, what it did was it said DERs should be able to access all wholesale markets and provide all products to those markets, period. So it's a seismic shift, and it offers tremendous opportunity in the years to come. I think we'll see it play out over the next 2, 3, 4, 5 years. 10 years from now, we'll say this was just absolutely huge for the industry because it opens the floodgates. It allows the technology innovators and the entrepreneurs to come in, where previously you couldn't take your Tesla Powerwall and sell it to any wholesale market. You just couldn't. And now you can. And it paves the way for different ways to aggregate those resources and like fit them together. And so it'll be very, very interesting to see. And it's funny too, because I think FERC is probably one of the federal agencies least known to the average American, but it's so critical in the climate challenges we face today. I don't think people fully appreciate it. So we've been talking about DERs, and I'm probably overdue to define like what in the heck is a DER anyway. So I'll read this because this is from FERC. So, DERs are any resource located on the distribution system, any subsystem thereof, or behind a customer meter. The broad definition is technology neutral, right? So it doesn't matter what it is, encompasses both current and future technologies. For example, DERs may include resources that are in front of, behind the customer meter, electric storage resources, intermittent generation, distributed generation, demand response, energy efficiency, thermal storage, and electric vehicles and their supply equipment. So it's hugely broad in that sense. It does not allow RTOs and ISOs, so those are the regional transmission operators and independent system operators, the grid operators, to prohibit any particular type of DER technology from participating in DER aggregations. The order was many, 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 many pages long, hundreds of pages, but this paragraph really gets at the heart of it. So I would be remiss if I didn't talk just a little bit about Voltus and what we're doing. Geoff, our mission simply is to be the distributed energy platform that fulfills the promise of the energy transition. We want to be that conduit between all of these different resource types and these markets. So that's what we're doing. We're building. And we built out our business on a few foundational beliefs, which I thought I would share with you all as relevant across the board. The first is that the energy transition will most likely resemble the IT transition, right? We're in the midst of this revolutionary shift in our electric grid infrastructure. We just went over that. We're moving from the centralized power plant control to an extremely decentralized, digital, distributed, diverse resource paradigm. We don't even know what future resources there will be. We know the grid is going through this dramatic change, and it likens back to the transformation of computing from mainframes and dumb terminals in the 70s and 80s to personal laptops to the smartphones and cloud services we know and love today. I was talking to Geoff, I think it was last week, prepping for this call, that one stat I love sharing is that today your smartphone is literally millions of times more powerful than the computer that guided Apollo 11. Now, which is more impressive, that we landed on the moon with less than a millionth of computing power of an iPhone, or that the iPhone has millions of times more computing power than the mission that first landed us on the moon? I'm honestly not sure, but the power of technology is something. And so the point is, much like this IT transformation, I think the energy industry is now going through its own change. Central power stations and dumb loads are transforming into distributed generation, smart consumption. And this is a much bigger transfer of value, actually. $450 billion per year is spent on electricity in North America. Most of this, much like the transformation of computing, will move to the edge, all while delivering these economic and sustainability benefits. So there's tremendous value and opportunity in this shift. And frankly, all these IT systems and cloud-based technologies that we already have built, it's time we put them to work in the energy sector. And so these are things we can all really start to control and build around as technology innovators as well. All right, so 2 is that I think the markets are already valuing this innovation in some regard. So do they have room to improve? Sure, I could talk all day about it, but this trend is not some far-flung concept. So These technologies are not whiteboard, pie in the sky thinking. They are here just as much as this crazy 10-speed automatic transmission is here. I'll confess, I did not know what this thing was until a colleague sent it my way recently, but it's a Ford General Motors joint venture. It's purpose-built to save fuel and improve performance, in particular in small engines. And so it got me thinking that the transmission is actually quite a good analogy for where all the innovation is happening on the grid. The gasoline is the kilowatt hours, the fuel in the tank, the solar, the wind, nuclear, fossil fuels, biomass, geothermal, so on and so on. But it's located across many different motors, many types of resources that are ramping up and down and doing all kinds of things, especially with more and more intermittence. So look no further than the Southwest Power Pool, SPP, covers 17 states across the Midwest and western parts of the US. 65% of their load, 18.4 gigawatts, was served by wind last month. Who would have thought SPP would be our renewable energy trailblazer? 65%. So they hold the record over all other North American grid operators, and they have one of the most used and well-paid operating reserve markets in the country, which serves to balance the grid from sudden imbalances. And so it's this balancing of the grid, the backstopping of renewables, the shifting of gears, if you're with me on the analogy, the faster, more frequent, intelligent response. That's what DERs will do on the electric grid. 3, these are the principles that we built the business on. Why do consumers need aggregators like Voltus? Why not just go ahead and do it themselves? This is where I often find myself explaining that nothing is ever as simple as it sounds. There is unfortunately no one electricity market, at least not yet. A girl can dream. The North American electricity markets are in fact extremely different from one another. They each have a mission to keep the lights on reliably. They're each governed to have just and reasonable rates. That's about where the similarities stop. So it's truly wild. I like analogies. So imagine driving across the country, but instead of a unified set of rules of the road and common signage, you instead had to speak 18 different languages to read the signs, just to know even basics like what side of the road to drive on, or maybe you had to apply in advance to convince the local town that it was even okay to let you drive through. And that's what happens with the energy industry. Or maybe a better analogy, going back to smartphones. Let's say you live in Boston, the heart of ISO New England. Your phone is connected to your Wi-Fi at home. You take a business trip, 2021 willing, and you arrive in Dallas, ERCOT territory. Turns out you have to install completely new networking software to get the same services you're familiar with. That would be totally unacceptable, right? It doesn't matter if you're in Boston, San Francisco, Guam, Prague. This is what we were talking about earlier. You turn your phone on and it's speaking the same TCP/IP network standards. You expect nothing less. So we've all grown accustomed to standardizations of technology in this way. Customers expect that, and yet that's not true in the energy markets. So that's where Voltus comes in. What we're doing is abstracting that complexity and building a single unified platform that connects customers to all of these opportunities in these markets and doesn't overburden them with the complexities. So I thought I would wrap up with just these are just some of my kind of future ponderings and predictions. When I think about like what might the grid look like 5-10 years from now, renewables are going to keep getting cheaper. We're going to keep leaning into them. I think we'll have 100% carbon neutral grid, and the marginal cost of energy will then no longer be relevant. The marginal cost of energy that most wholesale markets are based on today, it's, how much will it cost to burn that next kilowatt of fuel? What's the marginal cost? Usually it's something like a natural gas peaking power plant. But when the wind is blowing, it's like, what's the marginal cost? It's zero. So we really have to reimagine how these markets work. I think we'll see two-way transactions everywhere, which means that the transmission operators and then the local distribution operators, the roles there will blur. And with all of that, capacity will no longer be a problem. And I think we're going to focus all of our time and money on load flexibility and resource management. And lastly, those wholesale markets, I think, so not every part of the country has wholesale markets right now. I think we'll see that change. And ideally, we see it converge to a single. That would be the dream, would be one single market, but I think we'll at least start to see some convergence so that there can be standardized products across the board. And that was everything.
That was awesome, Dana. So lots of questions that I've got, and we also had some come in from registrants. But before I start peppering you, I'm going to encourage people to go into that Q&A and start to type away. So let's see here. I've got, given the unpredictability of the expected increase in the quantity and severity of events such as heat waves or polar vortices, primarily climate change driven, how do you think grid managers should be planning for sort of changes in peak energy demand? And, say a little bit more perhaps about how the DER system can help mitigate this. I mean, I think that's kind of at the heart of what you've been saying, but as the problem gets worse, sort of how do you see that playing out?
I'm going to think about that. So and I'm not sure I fully understood this question.
So what I think you're saying is that spikiness you were showing is going to get worse. Because if you think about the peak demands from heat waves, that just, again, you've got 1 or 2% of the year, but it could drive demand up. Similarly, if it gets, we get these kind of crazy cold events, that even if we're warming on average, we can still find ourselves with an awful lot of electric heating load, for example.
Yeah. Well, so let's break it down with maybe an example. So even if you think about the California duck curve, in isolation, it gets worse if all you keep doing is adding more solar, and then you add in, what happened this year, interestingly, was actually because of COVID, the residential evening peak got worse. So just as the sun was setting, everybody's load was turning on even more than in a normal year. And then there were the forest fires, which tripped a couple more traditional power plants offline. So if you break that down and that that's your situation, energy storage certainly helps. So you can store some of that sunlight from midday and discharge it in the evening. Electric vehicles certainly help while everyone's home during the residential peak. They've got those electric vehicles there, maybe depending on the state of charge. Everybody though has a different schedule, so some of those EVs are going to have something in there. And then also more, I didn't really mention this during the talk, but I also think more large scale transmission. When you look at things at a country level, when California might have their sun setting, but the wind in the Texas Panhandle or somewhere else might be just rearing to go, and what are we doing with that energy, and can we actually move energy more across our geographies?
That's really interesting.
That's something else that's interesting. Yeah.
It's a really heavy iron, if you will. I mean, in the sense of this long distance, high voltage transmission with, I think, what we've been celebrating, which is the ability to coordinate lots of little things to act like big things. And so it's so they can operate in concert.
Yeah, I mean, I think my perspective is the all of the above approach. We have to do all the little things. And so even just within California, if you have energy storage and you have all of the distributed energy resources sitting out there, well, for one, your risk of a giant power plant tripping offline goes from something to much less. You're not so dependent on these large contingencies, right? That happened. There were it's just such a good example of California this past summer, because there were the wildfires that they actually had to shut off certain transmission lines to centralized power stations that then could no longer produce their power. So it was like this confluence of things that resulted in this blackout in California.
Well,
yeah,
so
energy
actually,
storage.
let me pepper you with another one, because
yeah, go for it.
parents typed in, and also we got a question ahead of time, talked about the role of AI. And, you were talking about the increase in computation and the capability, and you showed us the really cool transmission. Maybe talk a little bit about why that matters. Sort of why does this increase in computational capacity, data, and artificial intelligence help solve some of that transmission? I mean, literally the gear problem that you were talking about, where that's hard, say 10 or 20 years ago, or even now.
So the AI that I'm seeing is doing usually one of a couple things. They're either predicting load or they're predicting pricing. So price forecasting is really helpful because it's sending the signal to loads that are price responsive. So if you can know that next hour or even tomorrow, prices will be such that it's economic for you to act in a different way or use your distributed energy resource or your energy storage, crunching those computations to figure out the optimized way to manage your battery, for example, is an area where the more AI, the better. Crunching the price forecasts, when is the system load going to peak? A lot of those demand charges are based on system peaks. And so that sends the signal to consumers to use less load or to run their distributed generation during those peaks. So that type of daily optimization is where AI comes into play, on top of price forecasting and predicting.
Yep, super.
I think for the grid operators too, there's an element there of it's getting harder for them to forecast what's happening.
Maybe I can just add a little bit, because I think also you've got this notion of a distributed locational marginal price, because things are so sort of distributed in time and space, whereas before a market signal to wholesale would be really an average of kind of big bus contributions from major plants, and now it's much more distributed. And so I think maybe the AI and computation can help there as well. So Randy asked a question, and I think it'll dovetail to something you said about California, that says, what's the likely evolution of generation infrastructure, and what effect will that have on the risk of sort of failures due to weather, geological events, IT hacking? And then the key is, can a more distributed generation infrastructure, regardless of source, be it wind, hydrogen, solar, become more reliable than the current system?
Interesting. I mean, I get, all of these answers are going to be, it depends. And certainly I can't profess myself an expert on these things, but, fundamentally, when you distribute things, it's more reliable because it has less points of failure. And when you start talking about microgrids and resiliency, I know the U.S. Navy is investing a ton in microgrids because they look at it from a resiliency point of view. They want to be able to self-supply if they need to. So it's not about fully disconnecting from the grid, but the option that they could, that they don't need it, is something that they look at. So I think distributed does correlate with more resilience. Obviously, we have to do it well. I'm not sure if that fully answered the question, but certainly if you think about single points of failure, single contingencies, and you distribute them, you just simply have less.
Yeah, no, I think that sounds spot on. And Doug asked a similar question, so I'm going to kind of move on. But you said something really interesting about the Navy, and I think that actually, let me try to make this linkage. What are some of the ways this technology could be thought about and being adapted and deployed in developing countries? And how might that
good one.
Close, if you will, the energy access gap?
Yeah, no, that's a fascinating one, because in developing countries, It's like when smartphones rolled out and everybody had a mobile phone before they had a landline. The idea that you can just kind of leapfrog in technology and you could go out and deploy mini microgrids that are solar plus storage, solar plus storage plus a backup generator for the 1% hours of the year where the solar wasn't enough. That can be deployed fairly cheaply anywhere, and you don't need those major transmission lines. So, you can approach it bottoms up as well as top down and just go directly out. I know there are a lot of groups working in places in third world countries bringing them solar plus storage solutions.
Yeah, I really like your analogy to the leapfrog, because if you think about what happened with the landline phone system, super expensive to deploy, much like running distribution or transmission, and then cell phone just leapfrogged it, and you only have to just connect the cell phone towers. And I wonder if we're looking at something potentially similar, and what you can imagine all kinds of investments that you could avoid.
Yeah, and said, just one more thing, Geoff, on that with the bringing it back to the Department of Defense, when our military goes out and sets up camp in other countries, they're not necessarily plugging into the regional grid. They're setting up their own microgrids, and so it's not a new concept to do that. It's always just been cost prohibitive. So I think that's really the thing that's changing, is that it's not cost prohibitive to go and set up a microgrid wherever you want, where the sun shines.
Makes sense. So Elizabeth has a question that says, hey, several times you mentioned a wish that we had one energy market across North America, and we don't. Given the diversity of markets, which markets have rules and which are more supportive or less for DER, and which are more challenging. And oh, by the way, the cat is also great.
Yeah, I saw that. Yeah, the cat. I meant to lock him out. He can get annoying. Well, I mean, I could talk about the different ISOs forever, and I'm happy to follow up with you. Which are most favorable? It's not going to be a surprising answer. I mean, you've got New York ISO, PJM, California ISO. Those markets tend to be more favorable. We've done a lot of work in MISO and SPP, which are right now less favorable. And when I say less favorable, it's really less mature and a lot of state politics going on. So one thing that has happened up until 2222 is that states can just simply, from a demand response perspective, so demand response being just load curtailment as a product, here's that cat again, states can just say no thank you. They can just opt out. And so that's why some of these more coastal, like aligns with the blue states type of grids have seen more of this development, whereas the states, I can tell you, Louisiana, they had a resource need. We tried to bring 100 plus megawatts of demand response to the MISO market. We had the customers all recruited. The Louisiana Public Service Commission just said, nope, we don't want aggregators, not in our territory. And so that's really the thing that will change, is this like federal state tension too that's happening, is just to get rid of that and to say, you know what, it's a federally regulated wholesale market. Therefore, customers can participate in it, and the states can't say no. That's a little bit of a tangent from Elizabeth's question, I think, but that's where some of the ISOs in the center of the country just haven't evolved as quickly due to not needing to evolve as quickly due to states mostly opting out.
Well, and yet I loved your mention of SPP as having 2/3 supplied from primarily wind. Yeah. But wind and solar.
Mostly wind. Yeah, some of the biggest wind plants in the world are there. There's a really good book. So if anyone's just like, I love this topic, Superpower is a book about. So Michael Skelly was a wind entrepreneur, and it's a really engaging book that talks about like the beginning of the wind industry, and it all started in like Superpower. Yeah, right. You'd like it, Geoff.
Yeah. I'll order it up.
Here, it's right here.
we've got a
Look at this. I'm not on commission, I promise.
Well, one of my, yeah. So we have a question from Robert about EV deployment, and I think we're seeing all kinds of news around, say, GM planning to switch 100% to electric vehicles in the not too distant future, which might make sense if you realize that over half, they sell more cars in China, for example, than in the U.S. What do you think some of the near-term challenges are for our grid and distribution system if that actually happens, and how would some of these DER sort of markets and concepts help resolve that, or do we just have to lay a lot more heavy iron?
Yeah, I mean, I really hope that EVs are viewed much more as a solution than a problem. I think that the flexibility that EVs will allow is huge and untapped. I'm very interested in the fleets of EVs, the fleets of school buses that sit around as a resource when they're not taking the kids to and from school. I think that's a phenomenal grid resource. And so my hope is if we do this right, we've got plenty of the capacity side. We've got all of this energy coming in from various renewable sources. And if we can marry that with the flexibility of load and the flexibilities of EVs and storage and all of that, that it'll end up being a strength, not a weakness, that EVs take off really quickly. Now, in certain parts of the country, will the local distribution networks have to be upgraded? And I expect that utilities might hem and haw about it a little bit. Sure, I'm sure we'll have some growing pains. But utilities are always resistant to change. People ask, who is your biggest competitor? It's always just status quo.
Yeah, great question. What if you sort of had a magic wand and there were certain infrastructures that you could cause to happen? You mentioned, for example, these big sort of transmission corridors that you could move wind or solar from the Southwest to California. What would you wish from an infrastructure point of view that you could get sort of laid in place that would make some of these other things more possible?
Interesting.
And it might
genuinely
even be at the distribution
yeah.
level, because you mentioned a lot of bilateral or two-way things. So
yeah, my mind just keeps going to, whenever I have a magic wand, I think about regulatory, not technology solutions. My mind just keeps going towards, if we could get these markets all speaking one common language, I'd invest in some IT upgrades for them. The systems that they're on are quite antiquated. Some ISOs still require you to install a T1 line. It's really something. So, I mean, just a consistent standard protocol for how these resources can participate across the board would be my first big wish. The second big wish would be for the local utilities to kind of get out of the way of the resource registration process. It's like the industry's equivalent, the bane of the renewable industry is the interconnection queue. The bane of the DER industry is going to be the equivalent. It's going to be the registration of those assets, because in order to register the asset, you need the local distribution utility to tell you a bunch of information that really isn't relevant, but it's their way of maintaining control. And one-line diagrams of everything. I have submitted one-line diagrams of target stores in Amarillo, Texas to SPP, and I'm telling you, it's totally not relevant at all, but it's the way that the local utility needs to be part of the process. So if I had a magic wand, I would get rid of those barriers.
So I'm going to ask one quick question, and then I'll close with one final. So the quick question is, you're at a company who stands to profit from the deployment of these ideas. How do your sort of vision or go-to-market strategy contrast with others?
Other companies like ours? Yeah. I think for all the other companies out there, I've seen a lot more where they directly sell to utilities.
Mhm.
We tend to try to avoid utilities at all costs. We really try to take the strictly wholesale market approach and build out those very, very difficult and long lead time market integrations, but really rely on that. So our differentiator tends to be that we're this market access platform for all of these resources. And in fact, we would look to partner with, I'm trying to think of a company everyone would know, like a Nest or a Tesla or, you know, some other company that has the assets, but maybe doesn't want to take the time to build out all of the different market integrations. There's, you know, real-time telemetry back and forth requirements and controls. We basically make ourselves look like a power plant with signals in real time. It's not just, we're not just dispatched, you know, in 2006 or 7, demand response companies were dispatched via like an email or a phone call. We now are fully integrated into the control rooms and dispatched just like a generator would be. But there's like weird tricks of the trade there where you need to make your various, you know, square pegs fit into that round hole of what grid operators expect generation to look like. So I think that differentiates us from a technology point of view and a go-to-market point of view, is we really talk to these a lot of national clients where we'll say, look, like, do you want to work with a different provider in every ISO territory, or do you want to just, you know, work with one set of protocols with us, and we'll, you know, translate that into ISO New England or into NISO or PJM, whatever.
So we're almost at the end point here. So if you think about the audience today, we've had almost everybody stay on the entire time. So that means these people are really interested in this topic, which means they probably have a lot of ability to influence others. And if you think about some of the things you said, your wish list wasn't so much more iron, but in effect on the software side, what would your charge be for some of the people who have listened through this to say, you know, how can you affect change, and through what avenues have you seen might be effective?
I love that question, Jeff. I mean, there's of course the micro decisions we make day to day, right? So I do think it's important that as individual energy consumers, we look at that and we look at the decisions we make and, you know, practice what we preach. And then there's more of like, how do you influence at the macro level? And, you know, at the very extreme end of the spectrum, it's actually getting involved in the industry. It's talking to, you know, making sure it's an issue that's top of mind for local politicians. Like this was Biden, I think, is the first president that ran on climate as one of his big, you know, pillar issues. And so more of that, it is actually, I think, making a difference, not to sound cheesy, because it's very easy to just like go about your day and, you know, like, well, I'm going to turn my lights on when I turn my lights on, and I'm going to just like go to work and do my thing. But it's talking about it, and it's those tiny decisions and, you know, voting with it and continuing to do it that way.
No, that's a great answer, and it actually dovetails because someone asked what opportunities exist, for example, for humanities and arts and sciences majors to work in this, and I think you've just kind of stuck the landing on that. Dana, this was delightful. It's always a pleasure to speak with you, and especially about a topic that, you know, you've dedicated so much of your life to, and you know, it's really impressive to hear what you've been up to. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jeff. And thanks everyone for listening. My email is dana@voltus.co. If you have other questions, I'm happy to chat.
All right. Thank you everyone for joining us today. And hopefully you'll be at the next Dartmouth Energy Collaborative Launch Series, and you should be on the mailing list.